Okay, so for today, we will be doing our first mission to Duna, which is the fourth planet from the Sun, and this game's analog for Mars. So, unlike usual, we are going to be starting in the tracking station, where we will wait for a Duna transfer window, which is basically just the point in Duna's orbit where we can make the most efficient burn to it, and if you draw a line from Kerbin to the Sun to Duna, the angle at the Sun should be about 40 degrees. 44, I think, actually. So we will be starting off with our Apollo-style command pod and a docking port on top. That will also open up whenever it is ready to dock with the lander. So, as I mentioned last week, this will be a Apollo-style mission wherein we have a lander go down, rendezvous with the mothership, and return home. So right here I've started construction on the mothership, which has got 5 nuclear engines, which are extremely fuel efficient, but also have a very low thrust-to-weight ratio. And they also only use liquid fuel as opposed to normal engines, liquid fuel and oxidizer, which further increases their efficiency. So I've also begun construction on the lander now below it, and it'll have a pretty low center of mass just so that it doesn't tip over easily. And so I've also added on those landing gear, so they will be pointing nice and wide away from the craft, which will again just help us keep from tipping over. I've also gone with the Terrier engine just because it's a pretty small engine and it's got a reasonable thrust-to-weight ratio for this job. And it's also pretty fuel efficient, which it just makes it a good choice for landers, and it's also one that I've used for some of the past ships. Now you can just see me strutting the lander and mothership together, and also the entire craft to the fairing base. And now you can see me constructing the fairing around the entire craft. And as per usual, we will be using a Rhino engine for our orbital stage. And again, placing our biggest fuel tank on the bottom, just because that will, again, probably use about 70-75% of our fuel. And so I chose the Vector engines for this mission, just because they have an enormous gimbal range, which is just the ability to rotate the entire engine, which will help keep us steady in flight. And I'm also going to be adding these 2 peripherally mounted side boosters, and I struggle here for a minute to find the right nose cone, but eventually I get it. And I'm also going to be using the Vector engines for these side boosters as well. They also have a excellent thrust-to-weight ratio, which just is a really good quality that you want to have for your lower stages. And so I'm also going to, after I grab these vectors, I'm also going to strut that to the main body of the ship, and I will also connect a fuel line going from the peripheral booster to the central core. And basically what that will do is it will tell the ship to only drain fuel from the side boosters first, and it will run all of the engines from only the fuel on those side boosters. And that ensures that once we decouple those side boosters, the center stage remains fully fueled, and this just allows us to have the most efficient flight possible. Now, looking at it, this is probably the biggest rocket we've launched so far, and as such, it's going to need a lot of help staying steady, which is why I've chosen those Vector engines and gone for those 2 sets of 4 winglets. So I'm just making sure we have all the crew, and we are good to go. Verifying that staging is good, and we are ready for launch. So I'm just making sure that I have all my displays up and they are ready to go. And we're going to throttle up to full thrust this time. And we have liftoff. So, just like last time, I'm going to go ahead and speed up our ascent by about 4 times, just because you've seen this before and we'll definitely see it later. So, despite the significant increase in our weight, our flight plan will remain pretty much the same, aiming to be pointing about 45 degrees by the time we reach 10 kilometers. And you can see that as I rise up here and get through the stratosphere, and particularly when I start to point prograde here, I have lots of wobbles, and this thing probably would have completely spun out were it not for those vectors and the winglets on the side. So there is a flame out and separation on the bottom stage, and we are now on to our orbital stage. We will warp up to periapsis and burn prograde, and now we are circularized. So our maneuver node to Duna is going to be a little more advanced than we normally do, just because tiny changes in a burn over this significant a distance can drastically alter the trajectory of our ship over this long distance. And so you've seen me decouple the bottom stage there, and just like they did in the real-life Apollo missions, we are going to have our Kerbal here go on an EVA and hop in the lander. And then we will decouple it and rotate the mothership around after opening up that shield. And we will have the lander just burn prograde a little bit, and it will dock at about 0.4 meters per second, I think it was. So all that done, we will deactivate the engine on the lander and activate all of the nuclear engines, and we will execute our maneuver node. And so this one was a particularly long burn just because we are using those nuclear engines, which have an extremely low thrust-to-weight ratio. And so as with most maneuver nodes, we weren't able to get it exactly perfect on the first one, so what we're going to end up having to do here is just creating a maneuver node mid-flight and just doing a little mid-course correction burn. And that will ensure that we get our Duna periapsis to be exactly 100 kilometers over the surface. And it's important that we get our orbit around Duna to be as circular as possible, because whenever it comes to having to rendezvous with the mothership, which is definitely one of the more challenging aspects of Kerbal Space Program, we are going to want to make sure that our target has a near constant velocity and altitude, and if we have our periapsis and apoapsis drastically different, then it will have a constantly changing velocity and altitude. Now, it's almost impossible to get it completely perfect, but I think once we've done our retro burn here and circularized and done our circularization burn, I think our separation between our apoapsis and periapsis is only less than 500 meters. And so we're going to go ahead and decouple the lander from the mothership and just lightly burn retrograde to avoid moving the mothership too much. And once we are at a safe distance, we will full throttle retrograde and begin our descent to Duna. Now, the nice thing about landing on Duna is, unlike Minmus and the Mun, it has an atmosphere, just like on Kerbin, which means that we are able to use parachutes and save probably 1,000 meters per second of delta V on our descent. And you can see our speed dropping to about 800 meters per second now as we enter the atmosphere of Duna, and that atmospheric drag is slowing us down to 500 meters per second now. We will deploy those drogue chutes, which will slow us down enough to deploy the main chutes, and we will now just coast down to the surface and deploy our landing gear and get ready to touch down. And this is probably the worst Duna landing I've ever done. You can see right there, I began burning too late, and we got a little bounce from the suspension on the landing gear, but nothing's damaged, and we're still good for flight. So, that done, we will go ahead and have Bob Kerman hop out of the lander can, run over here, and plant our flag. So another important thing to note about having to do an ascension from Duna is, unlike Minmus and the Mun, since it has an atmosphere, we will have to fight that on our way up, which will cost us some delta V. But now we come to the orbital rendezvous, which is, again, probably one of the harder parts of Kerbal Space Program. So what we're going to do is we are going to wait until the mothership is passing just right above us there, and we are going to go ahead and begin our ascent. And it's pretty reminiscent of the ascents that we do from Kerbin. And that's just because we're not going directly up and then directly right, sort of like we do on Nimbus and the Mun, but we have to do this sort of gradual turn to our right. And so we are just raising our apoapsis here until it goes above the 50-kilometer mark, which is where the atmosphere ends for Duna, and there's no longer any drag. And so we will warp up to our periapsis, which is going to be just slightly below the mothership, and we will begin to circularize around Duna. And so the first step of any orbital rendezvous is to first get our orbital inclinations to match. And so the way we're going to do that is by first waiting until we are at a point where we can be pretty close behind the mothership, because the closer you are to the surface of a planet, the faster your orbit. And so I'm now going to place a maneuver node on the descending node, which is the point at which our orbital inclinations are the exact same, and I will burn up, which is basically, it's just normal, and that will get our orbital inclinations to 0 degrees relative to each other. And so now that that's done, I'm just going to burn prograde here a little bit. I have to mess with my maneuver node for a little bit to get it right. But I'm going to go ahead and execute this burn after we warp to it. And this will just raise our apoapsis just ever so slightly so that it will intersect the mothership. And we have a separation of about 300 meters, which doesn't sound like that much, but when you're talking about orbits of over 100 kilometers over the surface, 300 meters honestly puts you at risk of collision, and so I just have to be diligent here with my burns and not overdo it and crash into the ship. So I'm just going to set my nav ball to be relative to the target, and I will burn retrograde to the target to slow my speed, and then prograde towards it. And now that we are within view of each other, I will point both of the ships towards each other and tell my lander to point towards its docking port, and then at just 0.4 meters per second we will dock. And you want to be extremely careful with these docks, because any faster than that really will probably result in them either bouncing off each other or something exploding. And so now the two ships are docked, and we're going to have Bob Kerman go on another EVA, and he will jetpack on his way over to the Apollo-style command pod to rejoin the other Kerbals. And so now that he's inside, we have no use for the lander, it's just dead weight, so we're going to decouple it, and it will remain orbiting Duna forever. And we will go ahead and begin plotting our course back to Kerbin. But of course, it's been about half a year or so since we left, and Kerbin and Duna are now in completely different areas, so we're going to have to wait for another chance for the two planets to get into a transfer window. So we're just going to wait until we were at that 45-degree angle at the sun. There it is. And we will begin our prograde burn backwards in the solar system to Kerbin. So again, at this distance, it's hard to be precise with my burns, but I'm just going to get it as close as I can, and we will point towards our marker on the nav ball and begin our escape burn. And so now I'm just going to make some manual adjustments to our orbit and make sure that our periapsis is intersecting the surface of the planet. And that done, we can now begin the long wait of just drifting back through space towards Kerbin. And you can see here, I almost intersect Eve, but we just barely miss it and reach Kerbin. And so once we are about 42 kilometers out, I will decouple the lower stage, and we will begin re-entry. And right here, our Kerbals experience about 30 Gs, which no human could survive, but that's not programmed into the game for that to be taken into account. So our Kerbals are safe in the bottom right, and we will coast down now at about 6 meters per second with all 3 of those parachutes deployed. Anyways, so that's how to do a mission to Duna and back. Next week, I'm thinking about doing a mission to Dres, which is the real-life analog for Ceres, which is the biggest asteroid in the real solar system that we know of. Any feedback is appreciated, of course, and yeah, that's about it. See ya.